Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Pete Wissinger.
I'm Paul Solomon.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we've got a double header, a little bit of a what we talk about mixed with a deep dive. We're talking today about filler games. And then we're going to pivot at the end to explore a specific filler game that at least Brendan and I have been playing a lot of on Board Game Arena. And that's the new little micro tableau builder called Faraway. But before we get into that, got an order of business here at the top. As you may be aware, nominations are now open for this year's Golden Geek Awards on Board Game Geek. This is an annual user voted awards system where they talk about the best games from 2024 in a bunch of different categories. But then there's a couple non-game categories, including best podcast. And we would love for you to give Decision Space a holler.
Yeah, 100%. It goes so far for you to include Decision Space in your voting in the nomination stage and after the fact. I would say, Pete, that this is actually the time of year that most affects our downloads throughout the entire year overall, which is shocking to say that this one thing in the entire year makes that much of a difference. But the sort of footprint of Board Game Geek within the hobby space is large enough that it really does give us meaningful lift. So as you're doing that voting, if you could just add us as one of your favorite podcasts, we would be hugely appreciative.
And another thing in that similar vein is we love it and really benefit when listeners give us a rating. It can be anything you like. Go Solomon scale, go whatever Apple podcasts or Spotify has for you. It means a lot to us and it helps us spread the podcast.
Whoa, wait, did you guys hear that?
What was that?
Wait, what? I think I know what that is. Actually, that's actually, Paul, someone has already heard your plea for reviews because we have a new listener review on Apple Podcasts.
That's so cool. I didn't know this is like live streamed, but that's awesome. Let's hear it.
Our last review before this was in November of 2024. So this is a fantastic kind of like, let's all jump into, the times, leave some reviews. And here's one from someone. The username is Hoppities, I think. Anyway, here's what it says. I never review anything. That's how much I enjoy this show. Decision Space is doing something different than any other board game podcast I have listened to. They're thoughtful and entertaining and digging into truly fascinating aspects of game playing and game design. Passing on this show would be like going to sleep early on July 21st, 1969. 5-star review.
What?
Do you all know what happened on July 21st, 1969?
Moon landing?
Moon landing. So this is one small step for board games, one giant leap for board game podcasting.
Wow. Super cool. Great review. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hoppities.
I'm going to give that one a 10 out of 10.
I love that. I've actually got like a Space Guy Explorer t-shirt on. Pretty cool.
Excellent. So thank you so much for the review. And that just gives us the kind of juice we need to hop into our feature topic, which is going to be about filler games.
All right, let me start this thing off with, I think, what is a pretty straightforward and obvious question for a start. Brendan, what is a filler game? Why is it called that? And how do we begin to classify if something is a filler game or not?
Yeah, let's just start with the easy questions because there's definitely not consensus around what a filler game I feel like is. But I will give you my opinion, and then maybe we can talk about Paul if you agree, Pete if you agree. I think a filler game is a game that is relatively fast. It's a game that's 30 minutes or less, maybe even 25 minutes or less. Has one core or a few very simple ideas that sustain the game entirely. Typically low complexity, and it's a game that you can typically play repeatedly and find great enjoyment from like repeated plays.
Yeah.
So, so um, to kind of hop in on that, I think that these filler games, they're that it's in the name that they're meant to fill in the gaps in a game night, right? I feel like the function these serve for me normally is if you're waiting for everyone to show up for game night and you don't want to start your sort of main event game, you can just kind of play a couple little things with whoever happens to be there. And I think really the big thing is that these need to be easy to teach and easy to
Mm.
set up. That I think that that's a key component of a filler game is I should be able to set it up and teach it, and we're playing in, you know, 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think, and you said something there that I was thinking about too, which is Jamie Stegmaier talks about wanting his games to be the main event or I sort of think of it as like the entree of game night, and not that they're necessarily huge or heavy, but that they feel like a substantial part of what you're doing. But yeah, there's times when you're waiting for people to come, and there's also like if you're at the Gamers Ranch, for example, you're in a game of Arcs, and I just finished my game of Isle of Sky, and we're trying to sync up, and so it's like, okay, well, let's squeeze in a game of Ink and Gold or Code Names or whatever. So they're definitely filling that time, and I think you both have said the right thing, which is that these have to come out of the box fast, get taught and played quick, and get back in the box fast because. Um, people might just be ready to play at a time that you hadn't exactly anticipated.
Yeah, and I think my whole exploring a few core ideas sort of mechanically pairs really nicely with this idea that you have to be able to teach it quickly, right? If you're just trying to teach one or two quick concepts, or maybe it's a concept that's tough to wrap your brain around, but once you can illustrate that concept, that people are like, "Oh, okay, I get it," like Scout, then I think that primes itself nicely for a filler. I will jokingly say I think fillers are also games that you could just fill your whole night up with. I like a game night where you just sit down, with 10 games out. You're like, we're gonna play all these games. Um, but yeah, I do think some people take issue with the term filler because it comes off as pejorative um, for a crowd. I don't know if I feel that way. I think it's fairly descriptive of what it is, even if you're using them to fill up your whole night rather than filling up spaces between heavier games.
Yeah, I get what you're saying too. I do think at least in the hobby at large where we're at as far as like being on board game geek, there is a lean towards this bigger thing, but I definitely am one that likes to play a lot of games on game night and is happy to like I'll play Ink and Gold every time I play games. Um, I want to sort of steer us in a particular direction here because we've all landed on these have to be quick and so on, but do they have to be light?
Mm.
And I'm wondering what we might come up with as kind of the thinkiest or most challenging or heaviest game that we would still classify as a filler.
I've never played it, but would either of you call the Estates a filler game?
No, it's a longer
No.
game.
Okay.
Um, I'm assuming if we would categorize Arboretum as a filler game,
Mm.
that thing is way brain burny.
Hmm.
Would you call that a filler play? I know you're a fan of the game.
I let me say that I think a lot of people would call that a filler game. But this is a good example of where like I play games like that all game night. It's probably going to take us 30 maybe more. If we all know it, we can certainly whip it out and play it pretty quick, right? But yes, that is I don't know if we would call it heavy, but it has all of this tough agonizing decisions each time you discard a card. So I think that is a good candidate where it gives you a totally different feeling than something like Drop or Scout or, maybe Far Away or any of the types of games we might come up with.
I'm sort of racking my brain for heavy because I think it's easy to name off really light filler games, right? Things like For
Right.
Sale or Hey, That's My Fish. Have you all played Hey, That's My Fish?
Yep.
Not easy to
Yep.
set up, but a
I
filler game
know.
for sure.
Yeah.
I gotta take a look with Lost Cities. Let's talk about Lost Cities because I think
Yeah.
this is illustrative of something. Maybe Lost Cities is a two-player game. Does two-player push it into a different category for y'all?
I was
Is
gonna say, I think that a flexible player count really helps a filler game, um, just because, you know, if we are saying it just kind of fills in the gap in a game night, be it at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end. If you have more than 2 players, that makes it at least a less flexible filler game. Because I was thinking also about, 2-player games, and there's a lot of these, like, short two-player games, like, maybe if we're gonna play Seven Wonders Duel, you can play Seven Wonders Duel in 30 minutes with 2
Yep.
players, but I don't think we would call that a filler game necessarily, or something like Shot and Totten. You could play that in
Mhm.
30 minutes, but again, I think that two-player games maybe have can serve a similar function to filler games, but I don't think that if I have like a collection of games where I'm gonna put a section that says filler games, I don't know that I'm gonna put those games in there.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There's a way in which, filler games are the utility players of game night. You know, they can kind of fill any slot, to use a baseball analogy. And so I do agree they have to have this sort of flexible player count. I mean, you can definitely have a Star Realms on your roster, right? If you and I are just sitting there and somehow I've convinced you to play it, we can smash through that in 15 minutes or something. But in general, something like an Ink and Gold that can go 3 to 8 players, or just one, or code names,
High
those
society.
yeah, high society, something like that. Is this a different category than party games?
I think so. Yeah, because I think that party games can often take longer. Um, I think that they're a bigger social experience. I think that some party games can work as filler games. Like, one that I think is really great as a filler game is Wavelength. And I think what really works about a game like Wavelength is that your start and end time is 100% flexible, right?
Totally.
Games that you can just play as long as you want to, that you could like play it for, as long as it takes for everyone to show up at game night and then just end it. And it's not like you ended the game early. So I think that certain party games certainly can function as a filler. And what's also nice about party fillers is a lot of times they enable extra people to just hop in mid game.
True,
And I think
true.
that's also really helpful.
I
Yeah, so
think
but I think you're talking out of both sides of your mouth here, because I also was thinking about Just One and games like you're talking about, or
mm,
code names, where it's almost like it's an activity and they tell you a way to score with just one, but you just kinda, oh, I can't remember it. Green team wins, where you just kind of play it for a while, and you have fun, and then at some point you go like, "That's fine." But you're saying that some party games are like long, and the only one I can think of is like Wilmot's Warehouse.
Or if you're playing like code names can take a decent amount of time. I feel like So Clover, if you're playing with a bunch of people, can take
Hmm.
a little bit longer. Um, but there are also situations where like it's easy for people to hop in, I guess, even if it is
Yeah,
taking longer.
sure.
it's interesting because I feel like there's a certain aesthetic that people mean when they're saying filler games often that party games lean out of by I think in some ways party games often de-emphasize strategic choice and emphasize other interesting social dynamics or decisions in different ways, right? Like Codenames is about our mutual understanding of language. Uh, so Clover, very much playing in that same space. Just One, also playing in that same space. But something like, I don't know, what's a filler game that I want to talk about really quickly? Sushi Go
Mm,
is a filler game. I think where you can learn it quickly, play it quickly, teach it quickly is fairly light, but does give you just a hint, just enough strategic choice or meaningful tactical decisions that sort of emphasize that aspect of play rather than others. And what am I missing here? I don't know. There's something in the argument that I'm trying to thread that's not fully tying together, but I think it's for the same reason that I wouldn't call something like Welcome to a filler game necessarily. As a roll and write game that scales, is fairly easy to teach, plays quickly, and is flexible, to me doesn't feel as much like a filler game. Is
certainly a
So
much
Welcome
harder
to?
teach there, right?
Sure.
Welcome to is a way harder teach, and there's also something there about the parallel play that maybe doesn't.
Sure.
I don't know if that's a part of it. I'm curious,
Mm,
because as we were talking, I was thinking about roll and writes like a super mega lucky box, which is a flip and write, or a cartographers, which is maybe a little longer. Um, but I think there are some quick ones like that that we might call fillers. I'm not sure. Are fillers more interactive than,
I think
some
we
other
sh
light games?
I think what we're getting at is we maybe want to make some like boxes that we put different types of filler games in. So maybe one type of filler game is like your filler party game. And that is
Mhm.
something that's maybe more like an activity. It's just kind of something to do that's more social, kind of as people are showing up to game night. So I think maybe that's one box. And then maybe another box is your sort of like thinky filler game. It's your filler game that gives you something to bite onto and something to tickle your brain, but in kind of like a manageable, small, short kind of box. And I think maybe both of these are filler games, but there's just, you know, they serve kind of different. It depends on when you're filling your gaps in your game night. What do you want to fill it with, right? Do you want to fill it with something that lightens? Do you want to fill it with something that kind of gets your brain kind of prepped for play? A box I would create is the stupid game box. And I
Mm.
think these are really helpful filler games if you're in like a convention situation or sort of a game marathon situation where your brain has kind of turned into mush by playing thinky, heavy things for hours and hours and hours. And you don't want to stop playing things, but your brain kind of needs a break. So you play something like Strike, where you're literally just throwing dice at dice and you're just laughing. And it's serving that function of kind of like refreshing
Mm.
yourself.
Mhm. Do you have any other boxes to add there, Brendan? I'm curious.
Ooh. I don't know if I have a box to add right off the top of my head. I think auction fillers is a subcategory of filler games. Things like Biblios or startups or for sale, which already was mentioned.
Mhm.
There's a lot of sort of bang for your buck light games. There's obviously card games. We've sort of been talking around that concept, but I think card games often end up being used as filler games because they're easy to transport alongside heavier games. So things like The Crew, which,
Mm.
a group could sit and play The Crew for an entire game night, but you might just play a few hands of it and move on to something else. The Mind, another card-driven game that I think is very much a filler game that you might play a few times. And another aspect, I said these are games that you could play over and over again, but sometimes the design of a filler is such that there's sort of a novelty to it, right? There's some gimmick, like The Mind, where this is a card game where you're trying to play cards in ascending order from your hand, except you can't talk, so you can't communicate at all with everyone else. So you have to play them just based off, reading each other's minds. But that's something that might wear on people. But playing it every once in a while, it can almost be this little amuse bouche in a way, where it's sort of like, yeah, that's really fun. Now I want to play something else, right? Where we might be more lenient on how we sort of think of filler games, is if it's exciting enough and it's not asking too much of us, it's not taking too much of our time, we might be willing to deal with something that's more frivolous or random in that space.
I think that's very true because and this is also true kind of the try-hard gamers as well, is like they might the folks that would look down on some of these games, they don't,
Mm.
like, really excite them, they don't wanna have it for dinner, but as you said with the amuse-bouche, because they're short, they're much more palatable and they can go, all right, that's fine. I lost for random reasons, the dice, whatever, but let's move on. And, maybe later I'll remember the turn or two that was fun. And it's not like it eats up your whole time with, something that's really not your taste.
Yeah, and this kind of makes me sort of think about, these are kind of like candy or potato chips. You're happy when you eat it, but it's not going to maybe satiate you. And I think a publisher that's really good at this, we've mentioned several Oink games. I think that Oink is kind of their whole ethos is basically to make games that we would call filler games. I think All Play does this as well. And I've heard Joe at All Play talk about how they publish games that do one thing really, really well. And I think that you can't get away with that in a game that takes an hour. But I think in a game that takes 20 or 30 minutes, if you're like, this has this one mechanical gimmick that we're going to play around with, I think that can really let that sort of design shine.
And the other thing that Joe has said about All Play, I know having just listened to the Fun Problems podcast with Peter C. Hayward and AJ, can't remember his last name, is that All Play makes games that you will actually play. That's their claim. And so I think a lot of these fillers will fall into that category where the hot worker placement game from this year that we're all excited to get out and play with, and it takes an hour, it might be harder to bring out a year from now when we have the next worker placement tile laying game, with whatever, because it's an hour. Whereas I'll play Big Top, I don't think I'll ever get rid of it. And I know I'll keep For Sale and Ink and Gold forever. So it may be that fillers are games that you'll actually play. I know for a fact that Trio was one of the best selling games of last year across the board, period. And that's price point, and that's ease of play, and that's, ease of audience and low barriers and stuff. I think fillers do that really, really well.
And so if I think about mechanisms that lend themselves well to fillers, we've mentioned a couple. I think you just said trio pull. I think memory is the sort of thing that you're going to find more memory in a filler game than, a long game. I think auctions work well in this. I think push your luck works well with this. I think set collection works well with this. These are sort of, mechanisms that are easy to understand what your goal is, but the game's creating enough variability that you're getting kind of a slightly different kind of, it's still tasty every time you try it.
Do you so something you didn't just mention is tile laying games.
Mm.
So would y'all count King Domino as a filler game?
I was going to ask this earlier as I saw it over there on my shelf. Uh, I mean, I don't know. It's such a. I mean, here's the thing: is my first instinct is like such a great game. I would just bring it out like on game
Yeah.
night to be like a big, like, hey guys, I really want to play this tonight, as
Yeah.
opposed to like we have a few minutes, let me squeeze this in.
Yeah.
So, but it does fit the bill. I think probably if your friends came to play, whatever TI 4, and you got a few minutes, you might, although you're probably not the kind of folks that like King Domino at that point.
I
Have we just real quick, have we internalized that filler is negative? Because we're all sort of like, I don't know if that's filler because, it's up here at a certain level. Like, have we
Well,
subconsciously internalized that
I don't,
filler
I don't
is
think that's
a
what I'm
pejorative
saying.
term?
I'm sort of going back to the sort of like entree versus appetizer concept. And I think that's where I'm at. But like, if I went over my top 10 games, I bet some of those are fillers.
Yeah.
And if I read reviews on games like, I know that if I read the reviews on Honeybuzz, some people would call that a filler,
Mm.
even though it's maybe a 45-minute thinky combo-tastic game. So obviously there's going to be some subjectivity there, but no, I don't think I've put any sort of a judgment on it.
I feel like every game group is going to be different of what they consider a filler, right? And every game night might be different based on what comes to the table. Reiner Knizia is another designer who I don't think any of his games, of his sort of tile laying games, let's say, or a lot of his auction games, like Modern Art, Raw, even like these are lighter strategy games that I don't think anyone would typically call a filler game, but I could absolutely see a group that was always leaning heavier and used Reiner Knizia sort of as filler games to fill in between heavier games that they were playing. For me, I would never consider those games fillers, but I could see for another group, right? If you're used to playing 2, 3, 4 hour games, if your group of, Barrage is a light game for your group, I could see you saying something like Modern Art or Raw just being used as sort of a filler game between these longer games. For me, King Domino doesn't feel like a filler, I think, because mechanically there's just enough going on that it just feels like a really light game. There's a lot of systems at play, not a lot, but enough that for me it pushes it a little bit out of that filler realm. And maybe Raw, even beyond its length, it's like what, like a 40-minute game to an hour. There's just a lot of things you have to learn and teach that would probably preclude it. So I think that's where I come down on. And King Domino is really like right on that line for me. I would almost say King Domino at more than 2 players is a filler game, and King Domino in the 2-player Mighty Duel variant is not.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, there is one other category. Well, not a category, but there's something else that we haven't said about fillers. which is I find a lot of time fillers fill the end of a night, not just
Mm.
when you're waiting for people to come, but it's sort of like you kind of wrapped up the little thing, and I'm trying to keep Pete there for another 30 minutes, and I get him to play Coloretto or whatever. Um, and I wonder if there's a different kind of game that is maybe better at that time of night. It's a little bit what you said, Pete, about like I know at Geekway to the West a few years ago, we played Witness at like 3 in the morning and just laughed our head off and had so much fun. And they're like, they're 4 minute scenarios. So it's one of those things it's kind of an activity you could do forever. We laughed our head off with Ink and Gold. But is there a different sort of game that is that end of the night filler?
Yeah, maybe that's where I was talking about with like kind of sillier games can
Yeah.
help with that, or games that are meant to be played kind of fast and loose, kind of up. I think Push Your Luck works well with that kind of thing. Um, I think about there's a new party game that I've really been enjoying showing people called Ito, which is kind of like a cross between the Mind and Wavelength, and it requires just enough thought to be, a game that it's a cooperative game where you're given a range, like maybe it'll say something that kids love on to one extreme and something that kids hate on the other extreme. And you're given a number from 1 to 100 that's like 90. And you have to give a clue that is what would be 90 on that scale. And everyone
Mm.
gives their clues and you arrange your cards without showing the numbers and seeing if you did it. So it's so funny and such a good time. And I think it works really well in that zone where your brain is totally burned out. Just because I think what helps is a game that is fun and funny even when you lose. Because these the end of the night games are games that people have expended most of their cognitive energy already. So we're in it for play now. We're not in it, to win as much.
Have either of you ever played it? Pete, yes, absolutely agreed. And I think you had mentioned Strike, and I think dice rolling, light dice games come into play sort of at the finisher slot here, the filler finisher, where it's sort of we don't know how much gas we have left in the tank, but we know we don't have a 90-minute game in the tank. So let's see how many fillers we get through. Escape is a Reiner Knizia dice rolling game, dice chucking push your luck game. It's spelled EXCAPE. That for me, I've played in a convention setting like this where you're trying to roll certain values and you're then claiming spaces based on
Mhm.
if you think people will be able to roll higher or lower than you. So you can sort of press your luck of how strong do I think my role will end up being. But it's silly. There's interesting decisions, but it's really one decision over and over. And I think that type of game can end up being a filler game, right? Where it's sort of a just pushing the button almost. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah.
Yeah, I have not played that one, but I have looked at it because I considered it for sublicense, I think, or
Mm,
maybe I don't know if it's out of print. Maybe I could relicense it. But I'm glad to know that you really enjoyed it because I do think it's got a fun twist where sometimes uh, to get into the weeds of this game a little bit, you sort of stake your claim on this board. It's almost king of the hill, and if you do
yeah.
really well, you're kind of towards the top, and if you're able to stay there when your turn comes back around, you get points. But sometimes players will like maybe intentionally take. Am I wrong about this? You can maybe intentionally take a low spot and it bumps people or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I don't it's been a while since I've played it, so I don't remember it exactly, but there's this decision of do I take a low spot or a high spot? Staking your claim based around the value of the die of the two dice that you rolled is a really fun decision of sort of how aggressive do I want to be at this point in the game? And it's informed by you're trying to roll basically a certain number. It's not that simple, but among by claiming those spaces, it's sort of how much you'll move or potentially move back. So you have to consider where it's my position in the game right now. I think that one I will say too, Paul, is prime for loving republication with something to really have driving energy towards the end. Some of these older push your luck games where it's sort of like, well, if everyone pushes their luck and it doesn't work out how they think,
Right,
there's nothing driving it. And if I remember right, that's one of the games that I had a very long play of. It was silly and fun, but very long.
right,
It was
right,
just
right,
like, oh man, we have no help mechanically to
right.
escape here. It's all on us.
Maybe even it could have a theme. Who
Yeah,
knows?
there is. Well, there's also a version called Rapido, but I
Okay.
think also themeless.
So, a couple things that you all said that got me thinking about why we would or would not categorize something as a filler. When you all were talking about King Domino, and I
Yeah,
think Brendan, you said something like there might be too much going on. I think that there's something in the filler that I should have important but simple choices. But also, I think if you get out a board, you've already started to take me out of filler. There's something about the components also that just reads filler to me. Like it's if I could put it on a coffee table, then it's
Yeah.
a filler, right?
Interesting.
And so
Ye
I'm thinking about, the I think the ultimate fillers that were early when I was playing games that got played a lot were things like Love Letter and Coup. And Love Letter and Coup are both games where I'm literally holding like two cards and I'm
Right.
making like a simple decision on my turn. And so if there's a lot of components, or if the teach takes longer than a couple of minutes, we've taken it out of filler range, regardless of how long it takes to play the game.
I think part of that is purely based on it's more expensive to put a board in a box. So if you're gonna have a filler game that's small, the type of game that's gonna often have a board, you need it to be a little bit mechanically heavier because you need people to pay more money for it. So you need it to be slightly longer. I think that you're getting into like physical medium dictating the types of decisions that typically correspond with this, which isn't to say I bet Pete we could come up with 4 examples of games with boards that feel fillery, but I also think you don't it doesn't jump out because it's so often the filler games that are easier to market, easier to sell are a deck of cards and maybe some tokens, so you can play no thanks or whatever.
Yeah, and it's I mean, you're right, as and if we talk about Oinks, there's certainly no Oink game that has a board. I can think of one, which is like Souvenirs of Venice, where and I guess this is true of Deep Sea Adventure too, where you sort of lay things on the table and it has the feel of a board, but there's no room in that box for whipping out a board. I mean, I can say Corgi Pileup, which I worked on as a filler. I would certainly say, and it comes with this teeny little board, but it didn't really need one. You know, we could have done it some other way, right? And I do think you're right about price point that um, people don't expect to see it there, and so maybe you can get away with not having kind of a board or heavier stuff, heavier components. The thing I wanted to say a minute ago, uh, we were talking about sort of like the simplicity of some of these games that are closer to activities, where it's like we do this thing and it's over, and then let's do it again. We do it and it's over. And I think this is really close to what you're saying, Pete, about the simplicity of the decisions in these games, where the game loop is incredibly small. And so the game loop in a game like Love Letter is draw a card I have to, play one. And in that way, it almost feels like an activity. Of course, the game itself is a very short loop as well, so you can keep coming back through it. But probably a lot of games have this like very small game arc and a game loop that is very small. Coloretto has small rounds, and the game arc is pretty small. You just kind of collect these cards, and it's not terribly different game to game.
Have you all ever had a little bit of a story here? Have you all ever had filler games that you've played the same filler for an entire game night over and over? So a story is that the last time I was at the Gamers Ranch for the Atom Retreat, there was a group of people who started playing the gang at 6 players at about like, I don't know, like 10 p.m. or something. And they were like, we're not going to bed until we win a hand of this. None of them had played the gang before. And they stayed up till like 2 in the morning, just trying to win a hand of the gang at 6 players with
What?
some people who like didn't know much about poker and like it was hilarious. And so
Wow.
I just wondering, are there any filler games that you would play for an entire game night? Or are these purely games that I want to play it once or twice and move on to the next thing? Or if I'm going to fill a night with fillers, we're playing at least 4 or 5 different games.
Well, that's so interesting. Well, the first thing is that when Codenames was a big hit and it came out, it was said often in my game group that, like, it was the game night ender, because as soon as it came out, you didn't play anything else but code names for the rest of the night, and I
Mm.
it's probably not that way anymore. Um, in a way, is poker a filler? I mean, you kind of play the same game of Texas Hold'em over and over and over and over all night. I mean, you have this sort of chip count stack that gives a shape to your performance, and also what you're able to bid and the strength and so on, but I don't know.
You've put a metagame around a filler game.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
kinda think so, right?
yeah. That's interesting. I Yeah, for me, poker's just almost in such its own category of poker's right, that the hobby lifestyle game filler version. Um, and for Pete, going back to your question, yeah, absolutely. But I think that's also a product of my wife, mine, and I love playing the same games over and over and over. So
Mm.
Airland and
Yes,
Sea
you
is a game
do.
where we'll just sit down and play it. Let's just play this 10 times. Or The Fox in the Forest. I think these are games people would say are filler games that Maya and I would just say, "Do you wanna play that for an hour?" And sit down and play it for an hour, right? Other games that fall into that category, I've absolutely had whole game nights of just one, where we had a
Mm.
stack of games, right? Even light games, other light games, Blue Lagoon sitting there, Modern Art sitting there, but just one hits the table first. And Paul, in the way that you're saying code names was sort of being, the game night finisher, or sort of the undertaker that ends it all. Just one I've seen do that as well, where it derails all the plans to play something else, like Zuvadis. Oh, I had a game night where I just wanted to play Zuvadis so badly, and just one would knock it off the table. It's just
I
no
have
one.
not had that experience.
Do you all find that there are some game nights where you're just not satisfied with a game night that's full of fillers? Like you're like, no, I really want to sit down and like crunch my brain on a larger puzzle, and it's just doesn't satisfy.
I think
I
it
don't think I feel that.
Yeah, I know you don't, Paul.
I also don't think that I feel that, because I think in good filler games, you're always building a plan, right? You're always putting the pieces together of something, even if it's Colorado. You're trying to connect multiple turns. I don't think I would. I think if I was playing just a frivolous game, right? I, something like bingo, I would say yes to your question, Pete, right? And there are games like that. People play LCR. I've heard of people doing that, right? Or bunco. When I was growing up, people would have whole bunco parties where you're not making one decision in the whole game. And I think that if I was being presented with something like that, I would absolutely say yes. I came back from this not feeling at all um, like I had done enough or accomplished enough, or that it was meaty enough or interesting enough. But I think that oftentimes the best filler games force you to think about a lot in just a short amount of time, and don't give you that many things to think about. But there's a puzzle to solve. Like Love Letter is built on a deduction puzzle of what's probably in the other person's hand. Still things to
Yeah.
think about, just not a
Yeah,
lot
I
of
I do.
consideration.
And obviously this is, as you said, Pete, like, I'm gonna have a slightly different feel on this, but every time you play one of these fillers, with some exceptions, you hold on to a goal and you
Mhm.
strive at it for a while, and in a good one, I think, you feel some agency towards that. I mean, when I play Colorado, I have a choice that's small each turn, but I can look back on them and see my mistakes, and it shapes maybe the way I play next time. And you know, I have enough to strive for in that moment, even if the stakes are low, that when it's over, I go, ah, I liked that. That was fun to do. And then I want to do that again, or I want to do another one again. And I find, maybe it's partly just the ADHD of it all, but I find a satisfaction in that quick resolution, that I don't think that it's about winning and losing, where, like, the loss is easier to tolerate when it's small. It's just that, like, maybe I just run out of steam on a long thing, I kind of, maybe I don't wanna hold on to one goal that long, right? And keep driving towards whatever it is in the third age of I don't know what.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
maybe I
mean,
wanna play a game that gives me feedback more frequently, like Castle
Mm,
Combo, where I can play it 3 times, 4 times in one sitting, learn something meaningful rather than playing a 2-hour game where I feel like I don't even there's so much noise in the decisions there that it's hard to glean that much about what went wrong. Sometimes it's how I can feel about heavier games.
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm the outlier here because there are a lot of my favorite games are bigger, heavier games, and they just deliver a type of experience that you
Yeah,
can't get out of a filler, and
yeah.
that's not a negative on the filler. It's just a type of experience that I crave that I can't always get from a night where we just play a bunch of little stuff.
Okay, I'd
For
like
you,
to
Pete?
stop you right there. I feel this is an important moment. I have a question I've been meaning to ask, and I need to push back on what you just said because I know that you would love to play a night of nothing but 20-minute trick taking games. And my question is, what percent of trick-taking games classify as fillers? Like, where does I mean, reconcile that for me. These are small box games that in many cases, especially if you're well versed in the what we talk about with trick-taking games, they're not hard to teach. You can play them, they're quick. You could play another hand, play another hand. So maybe there's part of you that's like, no, I do want to play arcs for a long time or dig into root, but there's also this totally other side of Pete that wants to be almost almost frivolous in how sort of silly some of these trick taking games can get.
I will say that my Tricked Game collection does serve the function of being fillers all the time. And that's why I said I don't always get what I want out of a night of fillers. There are some nights where all I want to do is sit around and play a bunch of card games. It's just a different kind of experience than sitting down and playing Age of Innovation or Brass or something like that.
And it
But yeah, I
is
think that I'm fine with calling trick taking games filler games like that. I don't see that as like a negative because that is literally a function that they have served for me over and over again.
for
Mhm.
me, often filler trick-taking games have very strong arcs because you sort of have the beginning when you get your hand of cards dealt to you. This is even in any given round, right? Dealt a hand of cards to you. The middle of your hand, when you're about halfway through, where you're sort of did what I think would happen with my hand work out or not? Am I in crisis or am I in plan fulfillment mode? And then the end, where you sort of see from that midpoint how things actually played out. And that really compelling arc is something that I think is a huge feature of why trick taking games are as popular as they are. And Pete, is part of what you miss when you play filler games maybe the lack of a cohesive arc where you have this sort of plan that you see to fruition and really get to ideate on as things go out? Or what do you feel like you're missing on filler? Is it the ability to build something complex, bringing multiple pieces together? What is it that's missing there?
I think it's part of it is going to be like payoff from long term planning.
Mm,
So there's that strategic depth that you're not going to get. And then I think another part of it is I've talked about really appreciating like the emergent storytelling of games. And I feel like fillers rarely give me that. There's rarely like a at the end of a filler to be like, wow, this is what happened. And that was, you know, that kind of thing that I just crave that I talked about in our expression episode.
mhm.
Fillers maybe are just not that type of expressive.
Hmm. That's interesting, and maybe that's partly because of the short loop. In the same way that you just maybe you can get some amount of expression and arc through a short story, but I mean, sorry, for a short story or a short film, but for something with more character develop and long form narrative, a fantasy gigantic novel is, some epic or some maybe you want to see the brutalist for 17 and a half hours and it'll really tell you something. And so I understand that. What do you think, just to, before we kind of shift over to far away, what would you say is the trick taking game that comes the closest? And don't say arcs.
To being a filler
No,
or
to being to sort of elevating. And again, that sort of creates a direction that's probably
something
bad. But
beyond, something beyond.
yeah, just like that gives you that arc of
So I'm going to go classic.
expression. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go classic and I'm going to say spades because when you play spades, you play it for a whole night. Like no one just plays one or two hands of spades, right? You play
Okay.
spades to 500 points. Like a lot of modern trick taking games are designed to be played for 30 or 40 minutes. And these classic games are designed to be played all night where the randomness of hand deal is going to be evened out by skill because you're going to play 20 or so hands of spades tonight. And so I think that's the sort of like big, epic, satisfying, meaty kind of
Okay.
thing that goes outside of filler.
All right. I think that for me too is the same experience I have with Star Realms, where it is. for many people a light thing, but I would love to play a whole night of tournaments and stuff on Star Realms, and I will eke out my win through my slight advantage despite the high variance.
All right, so maybe now is a good time for us to look at a particular filler that I think is doing some interesting things, and this is Far Away. So let's shift to a little bit of a mini filler deep dive on this filler game. So, Far Away is a 2023 release. It was published in the United States by Pandasaurus Games. It's designed by Johannes Guppy and Corentin Lebrat, with really neat, kind of quirky art by Maxime Morin. It plays from 2 to 6 players from 15 to 30 minutes, according to Board Game Geek, with a weight of 1.8. And I think that weight below 2 is something that really you find in a lot of filler games. And it's on Board Game Arena. I think that the game kind of became even more of a kind of hit because it really caught on Board Game Arena. And I think caught on is a big thing because I find this game to have a super addictive gameplay loop. Brendan, you've played a lot of this. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking that Far Away, the best pitch I have for Far Away, and then I want to leave the rules teach you because I feel like you can just tee up the like this is Far Away and hit all the points better than I can. But I think I can give you the feel of playing Far Away, which is that. So I drive a minivan. I have 2 kids, and sometimes I find myself in a position where there's a parking spot that's really tough to pull into. It is a parking spot that the minivan can only be put in that spot if you back it up. You have to drive fast and back the minivan perfectly angled into the spot. Far Away is sort of saying, what if you had to play this set collection game like you're trying to drive your car in a parking spot, except every time you have to back it up instead.
And there's like a 50% chance you're going to hit one of the other cars.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's just driving a minivan, right? Just kidding.
So, Paul, have you played this game?
So I I have actually purchased this game
Oh,
through my friend Chip, and Chip lives in St. Peter's or somewhere out west here, and I have not seen him in the 2 months since he picked it up for me. So I
so you've
haven't played it on
purchased
the
but do not
table.
yet own.
That's right. But I have played it one time on Board Game Arena, and I did know the rules internally, sort of like, I don't know, on the surface, but I played the game completely wrong and I did score 0 points.
Oh my gosh. Well, I
But
should note.
yeah, I did see enough to kind of
Okay.
understand what's going on. And I think in my role of color commentary here, I will have a thing or two to say.
I should say that I've only played this on Board Game Arena. Brendan, have you played this on the table at all?
I have not played. I've played a game next to people playing Far Away on the table,
Okay.
but I too have only played Far Away digitally.
Well, let me give a little bit of a rules overview. So, Far Away is a tableau builder where you are going to play a total of, I believe it's 8
8.
cards
Yeah.
8
into
cards.
a tableau. And then at the end of the game, you're going to essentially flip them all over and then score them one at a time by revealing them, starting with the last card you played and ending with the first card you played. And these cards have scoring conditions based on what else is revealed when you score that card. There's a couple different colors of cards. The cards, it can either be a daytime card or a nighttime card. And then there's these 3 symbols, which I don't even know the names of them. I call them like rocks, devils, and pineapples. I don't know if that's what they're actually called, but there's these symbols that you're trying to also collect. And your score is based on however your tableau scores at the end. Now, a couple of extra wrinkles. Um, you are open drafting for cards to put in your hand. And when everyone plays a card, they reveal it. And then you draft new cards for your hand based on the values of the cards you played. The person who played the lowest card picks first. going up to the highest card. So that's the only point of interaction in the game, actually, is this open draft. Because if there's a card you really want, you might want to play a low numbered card. Or if you don't care what card you want, maybe you take a card that someone else wants based on what they're doing in their tableau. The other wrinkle is that if you card you played is of higher value than the previous card you played, if you're playing in ascending numerical order, you get an extra card called a sanctuary. And these are cards that are outside your tableau, but stay face up through the entire scoring phase. And so that is where you're going to hopefully build up the symbols you need for those late scoring or those late played first scoring cards. I
And the
would say that
symbols.
go on.
No, you go on.
Well, I was going to say the last thing I was going to say is that like I have played this game a lot. I've played it over 200 times on Board Game Arena.
Oh my
And
god.
I would say that my score variance is somewhere between the low 40s up to the over 100. That's the
I have you
kind of
beat.
game this is. This is a game. Yeah, it's true. I've never gotten zero.
No, I'm the
But this,
best. No one has
I,
ever done what I've done.
what makes this game so sticky, so addicting, is this idea that you're chasing a lot of randomness. And sometimes the pieces just all fall together and it feels incredible because you happen to just grab just what you needed. But more often, you're just a couple things short and it just hurts. And this would have been 20 points, but I just couldn't get that rock, even though the last game I played, I was just throwing rocks away because I got so many of them.
Because it's a game about dreams, right? You almost you're when you start, you sort of have to break the mental gymnastics themselves. Like the first card you have can be the last one you flip over, right? So in some ways, that sets up a dream of how do I sort of play into this, and then invariably everything that you would need to come, right? It's a drafting game, does not show up. And at the end, everything you would want to be there is not there. It's all about sort of piecing together these two different puzzles. And I think this sanctuary mechanism that you mentioned, Pete, this sort of if you play in ascending numerical order, right? So if your journey, in some ways, I think thematically what they're going for is moving in the same direction throughout, you can eke out this little more value. I love that mechanism because it's something that really raises the skill ceiling. It gives you something to think about, and also just feels good. It's like a goodie mechanism, right? When a game just gives you something for doing something you already want to be doing, it always feels nice. Like I think anytime you get something, we just as humans like to get things. So anytime a game just arbitrarily gives you stuff, it feels good. And the sanctuaries almost always feel good. You know, it's like never, you just get points. Here's some points, you know?
Yeah,
Although
and then
the sanctuaries are I would say maybe they're not rewarding you for doing something you already wanna do, they're actually nudging you
They
in a
kind of
specific
force you.
direction, right?
Yeah, no,
They're
you're right.
saying, "Hey," and this there's several most of what I understand about the game is mechanical rules design, but there's several really interesting pieces, and this piece is fascinating because you have to play, correct me if I'm wrong, low numbers in order to draft early, right? But you want to play higher numbers to continue to ascend. And so,
Yeah.
because you're tying this sanctuary draft to playing higher and higher, worse and worse bids round to round, you can actually look around at the table and see, okay, they're here. They're probably going to keep going and play higher than that. Maybe I can get this card going. So I think that I definitely agree. The sanctuary is such one of the coolest things that the game has, and
Yeah.
because they live outside of the sort of flip them face down and reveal backwards gimmick, I think that they're very cool.
Yeah.
well, and the design is super smart because most of the cards that are worth on their own the most points are very high number cards and require a lot of symbols. So if you do play those at the end, you're probably screwed. So and then a lot of the lowest value cards just have a bunch of symbols on them, but don't score points. So if you start with those, that's also bad. So the game tells you, hey, you should play from low to high, but then creates cards that tell you to do the opposite, right? And
Yes,
that's
right.
just really smart design. Um, I
Yeah.
should also say that the quote advanced variant is that you get 5 cards to start and discard down to 3. And I don't know why that's not just the rules because your first 3 cards are so important to how you play the game because your first couple of plays really do mean a lot for what you're drafting towards for the rest of the game. Because let's say I grab one of those, Brendan, that says, hey, you get 10 points if you have one of each color. Okay. And
Sure.
let's say I start with that. Well, that's dictating how I'm drafting and playing for the whole rest of the game. Because if I can hit 30 points on that guy, I'm going to feel incredible.
Yeah, completely. I would say that advanced variant rule that you were just talking about, Pete, is the perfect example of games as products have to be awesome their first play. And when you're first playing the game, you can't make informed decisions. So I would wager that was a publisher level decision of saying this is too much, this is a light filler game, we need to cut it out, and a designer saying, but it's better this way. And I totally get it, and I always want to just have the games in the version of it's better that way. But I completely see why it gets labeled as advanced variant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I want to go back to something that you said, Brendan, because I this is an open drafting game, and open drafting games don't always feel like closed pick and pass drafting games, in
Mm,
my opinion. I almost don't want to use drafting in both cases because I think so much more about the latter than the former. But this one I think does it well because of what you said about dreams. The cards that you play, like think about Point City or Point
mm,
Salad for a second. In Point Salad, and I love this about the game, you get all these ingredients, which are points, and then you go like, well, I've got all this stuff. Let me capitalize and take this points thing. And this game prevents you from being able to do that almost entirely. You have to play down your scoring objectives first, essentially, and then hope and dream to spend the rest of your
yep.
day kind of fulfilling that. And it reminds me of in a game like Sushi Go, for example,
Mm,
where sashimi and tempura are essentially these dreams. And
yeah.
the bigger your dream, the bigger the payoff, right? Like you're saying with the four colors for 10 points versus something else for, 4 points. Three sashimi is 10, but it's going to be a harder pull, and two tempura is 5. And so there are really clever, clean ways to communicate the balance. And I think this game does not knowing much more about it past what you've said, but this game does a great job of doing that, especially with the sort of characteristic differences between low numbers and high numbers. And that's so cool.
Brendan, I have a question for you. As someone who's also played a decent amount of this, how skill based would you say this game is?
Mm. I would say, I mean, I think Faraway is really cool. Your agency doesn't always feel high. That doesn't mean that it's not a your skill is not being tested. I think that Faraway is one of those interesting games where it really incentivizes you to learn the card makeup to know what you should be hoping you might be able to draft into your hand and then play. So from that sense, I think it is high. Um, but once you have that in mind, um, you're doing a lot of speculating on what you think other people will do. What do you think, Pete?
My hot take is it's not listed as a mechanism, but when you
Okay.
know this game really well and you've memorized every card, you're ultimately playing a push your luck game
Yeah. Yeah.
because it doesn't say push your luck on the list of mechanisms on Board Game Geek, but ultimately when you've played this game enough that you know what's out there and what combos with what, you are laying down at the start super ambitious cards and playing a push your luck game because you're like, well, I know I could do it,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And a lot of times, like partway through your game, you just have to cut your losses and just score what you've already laid down as best you can and know that you're going to have suboptimal plays. But when that pivot happens, that pivot from, yeah, just this, then this to be like, how do I eke something out? But ultimately, it's a game that has a lot of feel bad moments because it's very rare that you kind of get all that you need, but it's so short. It's a filler that you're like, okay, let's go again because it's kind of like playing blackjack or something where you're like, no, I'll get it next time, right? So that kind of feels like a push your luck kind of thing to me.
I have a question here about the design, because we've sort of talked about it being a little bit lucky and high variance, like, and this is why knowing the deck so much helps you gauge like the likelihood of finding something that you need. Would you agree that this is sort of like it's got some luck to it? Does the card I need flip out in the same way
Yeah.
that Fantasy Realms does? You're all nodding, yes, for the listeners. Um, because In the game, let's say the 3 of us are playing, how many cards are flipped out on the table for us to bid on?
Is it players plus one?
I
I
think it's
think.
players plus 1. Yeah.
Because if it was players times 2, that would be reduced dramatically. The chances of us seeing what cards we want would increase substantially. Um, and of course, if it's players plus 2, it's a slight decrease. And so it gives, it's not in the rules, I'm sure, but it gives players room to, you know, spice the thing to taste. And I think that that's cool. I always like to post on Board Game Geek, homebrew variants that people can try for my own games. And when people say, "What if you did this?" I'm always like, "Yes, do that."
Yeah.
Because I'm not super like, "No, this is the version of the game that everyone should play." And I think that there's room for that here.
Yeah. I do think maybe as a way to close, and I don't there's a lot of cool stuff in Faraway, but one of the cool things that this conversation has made me realize is the fact that this game scales up to 6. I haven't played it at 6, but I do think this sort of setup of leaving room in the design for dreams. Jake and I used to talk about this because the Quirkle designer, Susan McKinley Ross, do you know Quirkle? It's cool,
Yes.
like they're
Yes.
really cool. So Pete, it's this sort of abstract, very like popular, mass markety game that kind of is ish Scrabble ish, but you're using colors and Scrabble ish, Paul, from the perspective of you're
Yeah, yeah,
laying them on
yeah.
a grid,
You've
but you're
got them on a
using
grid and you
colors and
reuse
shapes.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And she said that games should always leave room for bingos. And what she meant by that really was that you should leave room for something that is unlikely to happen regularly, that players can get excited about when it does, and that it's cool to see it happen. And I think Faraway is perfectly positioned as a filler game that can accommodate more players to have these sorts of dream cards, because the more people doing it, the more likely someone will do it. And then that adds a level of excitement. So I would always rather I'm the one who hits the bingo, but it's cool if someone at the table does, right? It feels like a more exciting play. I'm going to leave the play with what you said. Sometimes you feel like you're missing playing filler games of some sort of ludonarrative equity of this cool thing happened. And I think that that's a cool thing that can happen with higher player count games and fillers is you can have more randomness, have things that are less likely to happen, but with more players playing, they become more likely again. And then you all get to see something cool happen that wouldn't work as well in a design that accommodates fewer players. And I think that's where that tension between all the way back in the conversation, I said, well, King Domino at 2 players with it does add more tiles, but it feels less fillery to me. I think it's in part because it's a little bit less random. It's zero sum. The decisions I'm making are taking away directly from my opponents in the way that at 4 players it isn't. And I think that in some ways, Far Away is sort of this perfect capstone to our conversation. Thank you, Pete, for setting up the whole episode, because it sort of to me illustrates the uncertainty in the decision space is a really key thing for fillers, right? If you don't have at least moderate to high uncertainty, all of a sudden the game's going to be thinky, even if it's not that complex of a game, because you feel an onus to not make a mistake, not miss something. So yeah, that's my closing thoughts. Sorry for
Do you
taking
have
you on a far away journey.
do you have a review, Brendan? Since this is a, if
That's what I
we're
was
Oh
gonna
calling
say.
this a
I'd
mini
love
deep
to
dive. Yeah.
usually do
oh
it
gosh,
earlier, right? But I'd love
Yeah.
to do
yeah.
just like a little capstone.
Yeah. Solomon scale for me, so for our listeners who don't know, right? 1, 2, or 3. Uh Far Away for me is a perfect 2. This is a really cool game that I will think about more than I will want to continuously play. I think it has so many fun, clever gimmicks, but when I'm playing it, I definitely, as I want to play games a lot, I play it more and I don't feel I'm being super rewarded for that, I'm less incentivized to continue playing. So I do like Far Away. It's just not a game that I would love to invest ample amounts of time into, which is a really annoying nitpick for someone who likes the game.
No, I think that's actually perfect, and it does highlight a difference between some fillers that there are those that we would still call fillers, but you wanna spend your night with, and
Yeah,
then there are others that are probably best just being brought out every once in a while, like, it'd be fun to play around to that.
yeah,
Again, with my limited experience here, I'm just gonna rate the design itself. I think the design is a 3 out of 3. I wish that I had come up with these ideas.
yeah,
Um, there's something that it does where it's blind bidding, which is often fun, but it ties the blind bidding to the placement in a way that a game like Art Society does not do. I really like that. I like the climbing, and I think the thing people talk the most about, which is you score backwards, is actually the smallest piece of the game. It's sort of like they didn't even have to describe it that way. You could just say cards only look forward or something. Um, but I'm excited to actually get it on the table. I think it is one that I will keep around so long as my game groups will be excited to keep playing it. Gets a 3 out of 3.
So it's kind of interesting because the fact that I've played it over 200 times means it would be ludicrous for me to give this anything lower than a 3, right? Because I've spent hours and hours playing this game. But what I think is for me playing this game only on Board Game Arena is basically like playing solitaire on my computer, right? Because there's a high variance of whether or not everything clicks together, but you're just chasing that good feeling. And so as like a sticky solo puzzle, it's probably a 3 because there's just something so addicting about trying to get a higher and higher and higher score. When I score in like the high 80s and above, it just is such like that gambler's rush. But in general, like for me playing it as a filler with my friends, it's probably a 2. It's not quite as interactive as I want, and it maybe requires a little more thinking than I want out of a filler. So I'd say probably as a filler, it's like a 2 for me. But as something for me to do on Board Game Arena for a couple of minutes, it is a 3. And so I don't know how to categorize that, or if that even makes sense, or if that's even fair as a review, but that's where I'd put it.
It's absolutely fair. And I want to hear your review. And by you, I'm talking to you, the listener. If you played Faraway, you should come to our Discord, and you can find a link to it in our show notes, or on decisionspacepodcast.com. It's basically just like a chat room in your browser or on your phone with other people who listen to Decision Space, where we talk about games, kind of like what we do in this podcast. So if you're interested, come there. Tell us what you think of Faraway on the Solomon scale, 1, 2, or 3, in this week's notes. Also, vote for us on Board Game Geek in nominations for Best Podcast of the Year. Please, please, please. Yeah. What are we gonna do coming up? Do we have anything we want to pull back the curtain on? Anyone?
We haven't really made like an exact schedule. I've got we've been talking about Paul leading an episode on player count development.
Yeah.
I really want to do one about how communication works in co-op games. So those are some of the
do
ones
one on fighting games, but I think that's too narrow. So hear me out. I'm gonna pitch this to y'all live. Donkey
Okay.
Space. Let's just do a whole episode on Donkey Space. I
Wow.
know that you know that I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You and I also talked about doing an ode to tiles, and I think that will make for a
Be
good,
so
because that
good.
is probably my favorite mechanism. So check us out on Discord and tell us what you think might make a good episode. We'd love to talk.
I also want to hear people's favorite fillers that we didn't mention, because we did mention a lot of fillers, but I want to know at your game night when you are waiting for people to show up or you want to play something short at the end of the night, what are your go-tos? I want to know what they are.
You should play Set is the answer. And then
No.
No way.
No way.
No way.
Awesome. So
Absolutely
with that,
not. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good night.
bye y'all.
Bye-bye.